I just want to start really briefly by thanking Susan for organising an excellent conference, and also to thank her for asking me to contribute. It's a great privilege for me to come and talk to you today about the work that we've been doing. My task, like the other speakers, has been to outline our state of knowledge for the medieval Highlands from AD 900 to 1600, to compare the situation in the Highland region to the national scarf, to identify what seems to be missing in the Highlands, and then to highlight a few important sites. It's going to be a bit of a gallop, I'm afraid. There's lots of material to cover in 25 minutes. The executive summary for medieval scarf highlights 5 principal research themes, which I've put on this slide for you. Really, the headline research theme is the idea of state formation. So from AD 900, it's when Alba first starts to be mentioned in documentary sources, and by the end of the period, Scotland has emerged as a single nation, a single kingdom. These primary research headings are supported by a set of research sub-themes, and just a really quick glance at the medieval scarf will enable you to identify very easily some areas where the Highland Council region has a really critical contribution to make. For example, in the process of understanding state formation, it highlights exploring and defining North Scotland. It wants to explore the lowland Highland divide, and it wants to look at territory. So these are areas where the Highland Council region can really evidently make an important contribution. There's one other element which I've chosen to highlight, and it builds on something that Andy said yesterday. Medieval scarf calls for high quality field excavation and a move away from traditional trial trenching approaches to open area excavation, which is a really important thing to note going forward in the Highland scarf. So how does the situation compare to the national picture? In some ways, comparing the Highland region to the national scarf can give you a bit of a dim view of medieval archaeology. Yes, there are lots of important things which are missing. We don't have a decent survey of the locations of medieval parish churches. We don't have good distributions for where the castles are. There's been no organised recording for the late medieval sculptural corpus apart from in the West Highlands. There's no organisation for recording masons' marks. We don't have any pottery kilns, so there are huge areas of gaps in our understanding. But I wanted today to be a bit more of a celebration of what we found actually since Scarf was published. Much of what's missing in the national scarf is also missing in the Highlands. Scarf notes that there were fewer than 10 medieval houses which date between AD 400 and 1100, so again we're back to counting on our fingers. Although Port Mahomet Structure 1, the bag-shaped building that Gordon showed you yesterday, can be counted among that number. It also notes that there are very few buildings nationally which predate 1200 that are still extant, and I'm not aware of any in the council region. And the perennial problem of identifying medieval rural settlements plagues the Highland zone just as it does the lowland zone, and further work targeting missing agricultural strategies is still needed. So let's just look really, really quickly at North Scotland. Like the prehistory, in some ways it's better represented in the Western Isles, in Orkney and Shetland. But Norse colonisation comes through Caithness, presses through Sutherland and arrives in Ross. So these counties have a really critical contribution to make to our understanding and definition of North Scotland. Two key sites which I don't really have time to go and look at today are Freswick Links up in northeast Caithness in the northeast of our region, and right at the opposite end in the southwest of the region, the recently excavated early 10th century boat burial at Portinell and Moore and Ardnamurchan. Two really critical sites that contribute a lot of information to the national picture. And then, of course, significant contributions have been made by looking at place name and documentary evidence by Barbara Crawford and colleagues, which allows us to plot the extent of Norse colonisation, and this is propped up by identifiably Norse artefacts which tend to be dominated by pagan graves, and then diagnostic hoards of metalwork. This slide shows you a distribution of identified and excavated pagan graves and the distribution of Norse hoards. So it shows you the colonisation of Caithness, Sutherland and pressing into Ross. At the same time that this colonisation is happening, the Scots are moving east and north at the Great Glen into Moray, and from the 9th to the 12th century, Ross acts as a sort of frontier zone which is controlled by Norse or Scottish warlords up until David I comes in and really stamps royal authority on the area. At the same time, we can trace the origins of the lordships of the Isles with their hybridised rulers of Gaelic and Norse ancestry. So there's a lot going on in this early period, but it remains something of a dark age in the Highland region. I've chosen to look really briefly at Dingwall. The Highland town of Dingwall, along with Chromity, has long been thought to be the site of an early thanage of the 11th century onwards, but Dingwall specifically has been held to represent the southeastern frontier of Norse colonisation and influence, and of course the place name, which is thought to derive from the Old Norse Thingvalla, meaning field of the assembly, is always highlighted it as an important site. So a project undertaken in 2012 by the Dingwall Thing project, which was led by OJT Heritage and Dr. Oliver O'Grady, looked at the potential location of the Thing site in Dingwall. Traditionally, it had been suggested that a natural terraced hill on the west of the town was the site of the Thing. It's known as Gallow Hill, so it remains an important site for a potential site of execution. But Oliver's detailed landscape research identified an alternative location for the site of a mound in a level field adjacent to St Clement's Church. The site has been much altered in the post-medieval period and was appropriated as a memorial to the first Earl of Chromity in the early 18th century with the addition of a mausoleum and a great stone obelisk. So fieldwork commenced with topographic survey and ground-penetrating radar surveys, but if you look at the view of the Chromity car park here, you can see that the Thing site is still with us in the topography. You can see it rising up in the car park with the memorial central to that. So Oliver identified this as the ghost of the Thing site, which is now overlain by the Chromity Memorial car park. He excavated a single trench across the north side of the mound, which encountered a series of interleaving estuarine silts and mound makeup deposits, and he was able to model the original location of the Thing was much more riverine, and it was affected by tides, and actually at times was pretty much cut off by the River Peffrey, which is now much clogged, but he managed to sort of re-establish Dingwall in very much a maritime space. You can see in this slide here that you've got estuarine silts in the foreground, and then going closer towards the memorial, you've got the truncated mound makeup deposits. Radiocarbon dating suggested that the mound was erected around the mid-11th century, and then it was added to and enhanced in the 12th to the 13th century. The site belongs to an international group which can be traced from Iceland, Shetland, Isle of Man, mainland Britain, and through Scandinavia. And they're thought to be the sites of seasonal gatherings of freemen who went there to access organised judicial resolution of disputes. And so Dingwall remains a key national representative for the development of Scottish judicial governance, so it's an important contribution to the Highland Council region, but also to wider Scotland. Just moving on really briefly to have a look at Port Mahomet, because it's still really interesting, but for different reasons in the 9th to the 11th century. Here we can see Port Mahomet sitting like a beacon in the heart of the Firthlands, but as an undefended settlement, it's also in a very vulnerable maritime space. And it appears that the monastery succumbs to a Norse raid in the early 9th century. We excavated a huge phase of fiery destruction which destroyed the monastic workshops which had been engaged in producing holy books. On top of this layer of fiery destruction, we found lots of smashed picture sculpture which had been reused as hardcore, and we detected potential weapon-related trauma in the monastic cemetery to go with it. Activity quickly resumed on the site with a different focus, still craft working, but they were engaged in making silver ingots and leaded bronze acorn-shaped weights, which are without parallel to date. The cattle-based monastic farming regime shifted to grain production, grain storage, and potentially grain redistribution. But by AD 900, when this period really starts, everything had spattered out. Very few burials were being made in the cemetery, and what we're left with really is a scatter of Norse place names on the peninsula, names like Cadball, Bindle, Tarrell. They seem to be remembering Norse farms. In AD 1000, a big silver hoard is put in the churchyard. It's one of the best Highland hoards that we have. And then in 1035, there's a documented battle, the Battle of Torfness, which has been suggested to have been the Battle of Tarbotness. So it's these sprinkling of evidence types that we have, which really characterises the 9th to 11th century in the Firthland region, which, as I say, remains something of a dark age in and of itself. So, galloping forward into the later medieval period, things seem to get a bit brighter archaeologically. The archaeology of the Highland Council region becomes vastly more visible, and in many instances remains visible in the landscape today. I threw this map together really quickly using some pretty crude searches of Canmore, And it's designed to just give you a snapshot view of the distribution of medieval churches, which are shown here as yellow spots, the medieval burghs shown here in red, the location of castles in yellow, just to really give you a snapshot of the bounty of late medieval archaeology. I mean, it's comparatively speaking, it's absolutely dripping with potential sites for exploration. And even this informal overview makes a strong case for the Highlands zone and the West Highlands deserving our special attention. A couple of other things which I've used with the distribution map are known bloomery sites, which seem to fill in this gap in the northwestern corner where we don't really have many signals to go for. And I've also included West Highland sculpture where it lies within the Highland region. So it's a very lively picture that emerges just from a really crude desk-based look at what's happening. I'm going to follow on with a really rapid tour of the burghs to put chromity in context and then look at Port Mahomet in the later medieval period, Ellendon and Castle Sinclair Gernigo. So there's a lot of ground to cover. Comparatively speaking, the burghs have been neglected. Inverness has had more excavation than some burghs, and there's a working deposit model which allows us to identify areas where deposits don't survive and where potentially quite deep sequences survive. And chronologically, there's a model which puts forward the potential for early 11th century cultivation. I'm not sure if that's been confirmed. And it's not until the 13th century that settlement really starts in earnest, and it's not until the 14th century that any form of urban planning has been detected. It burns down. Everywhere in the Highlands seems to burn down, and then it's rebuilt using the same burgage plots in the 15th century. Tane, of course, has recently been published very expertly by Richard Oram and colleagues, funded by Historic Scotland and the Scottish Burgh Survey. For large periods of the Middle Ages, Tane wasn't actually technically a burgh but an immunity, so it had a clear area where sanctuary could be sought. And this slide shows you the outline of the immunity as reconstructed by Richard Oram. So it's a big semicircular territory overlooking the Dornoch Firth, and its perimeter was marked out by 4 girth crosses. And I've juxtaposed it with the medieval sites that we identified from desk-based survey when we were looking at the Tarbert Peninsula in the medieval period. And you can also see the location of Fern Abbey with its potential estates to the south. So it's really an example of how much you can reconstruct to the medieval landscape without breaking ground, which is an important thing to remember when we're designing the research framework. To the south of this, of course, is Chromity, and I wanted to highlight this project because it's exemplary in so many ways. The site was first exposed, I believe, by storm damage, and so it was framed very much as a rescue operation. But they did put together a very well-researched project design, which was published online in advance of the execution of fieldwork, which was very high quality. It was executed across a large open area, and it had embedded community participation. It really should serve as a model of how to attempt to excavate medieval sites in the Highland region. And this was rewarded by a really remarkable sequence of buildings from the 13th going right through to the 19th century. Some form of organisation seems to have been developed through the 13th to 15th century, and again, the whole place burns down and is rebuilt. They have some really interesting assemblages of medieval artefacts and environmental samples to furnish this story. They're still being worked on. So looking towards future work at the burghs, I thought it was a nice opportunity to highlight the potential trove of information, if you like, that treasure trove finds can provide in exploring medieval landscapes. The treasure trove unit reports that around Fortrose and Dornoch in particular, that an impressive quantity and range of material, which includes quantities of coins, have been recovered from around the burghs. This slide shows you a snapshot of some of the finds which have been recovered from around Fortrose, and you need to note that there are book clasps and medieval lead writing sticks, so there's obviously quite a literate community at Fortrose, and it might be an opportunity for us to explore the presence of some form of church-based education in the Highland region. Okay, so moving on very quickly to Port Mahomet. It is better known for its brilliant century of Pictish monasticism, but it's actually quietly made an equally important contribution to understanding the Highlands in the later medieval period, because to get to the Pictish strata, we had to work our way through a stratified sequence of medieval churches, burials, buildings and field system, which were all accompanied by rich artefactual and ecofactual assemblages. The arrival of the Middle Ages is marked by the building of this simple single-cell stone church here, which has a single burial inside it and a bell-casting pit. It's elaborated in the 13th century with the addition of a chancel. It's much, much enlarged in the late 14th century. The plan at the bottom, you can see it's almost tripled in size. And by the 15th century, it's been furnished with its famous barrel-vaulted crypt with an aumbry for storing holy relics, so potentially another site for pilgrimage, which is another theme that medieval Scarf encourages us to explore. In the fields outside from about 1250, a small fisher village springs up. It's characterised by huge shell middens, which you can see peppering the slopes of the hill here and here, and it had a small house platform accompanied by an oven and a well. At the same time, the monastic vallum is levelled and the area is given over to ridge and furrow cultivation. The middens were a combination of food waste, bait preparation and domestic waste, which yielded a really interesting assemblage of fish bones. They seem to be fishing cod very efficiently to surplus, butchering it for salt preservation for exchange. This went hand in hand with a rise in sheep numbers and evidence for textile working. And the date parameters for the fisher village are really marked by a coin use profile, which starts in about 1250 and stops in 1350. The pottery is rather crude by way of dating, so we've chosen to look at the coin use profile as diagnostic in this case. Interestingly, from 1350 to 1450, there's a real hiatus. There are no coins from that century, or from that 100 years, and we don't know quite what that hiatus means. There doesn't seem to be a hiatus in burial in the church. It may be a downturn related to the plague, to the Black Death, we don't know. From 1450 to 1550, things really take off again. The coin use profile lifts off with lots of base metal Scottish pennies circulating in quite significant numbers, and the fisher village is abandoned by this point, and the site's reorganised with big stone enclosure walls which lace across the site and incorporate a purpose-built smithy. We have got a large assemblage of ironworking slags which derive from this activity. There were smelting iron there and there was smithing iron there, and we found several fragmentary examples of really enormous rotary grindstones which had been used to sharpen large bladed weapons, so effectively arming themselves in this period. So this sequence outside was matched by 88 stratified medieval burials excavated in the church, which date from the 13th to the 16th century. This is a plan of the density of burials. And one grave in particular deserves special mention because it was so exceptional. At a certain moment in the late 15th century, a large grave is excavated right in the middle of the nave, right at the mouth of the crypt. And in it is buried the tallest man in the medieval population. He died a very horrible, violent death, which involved a blade wound to his face, which basically detached his jaw from his face. And he was interred in this very special place in the church, and quite incredibly, 4 disarticulated skulls, which had been curated, we don't know, by a grave digger, we don't quite know what the source of the skulls were placed around his head, which is a pretty extraordinary medieval burial rite. And if that wasn't enough, at a certain moment in time when his burial had become skeletalized, they re-excavated the grave, removed his skull, and put another man's body on top of him, replacing his skull, so still adorned with these 4 skulls. In the context of the ironworking and the sword making outside and the rise of clan rivalry in the period, it obviously belongs in this, but it's really quite an extraordinary example of how unorthodox the medieval period might be in the Highland region. So more broadly, the medieval assemblage of burials from Portmahomack is a critical assemblage nationally and also to the Highland Council region. It's by far the best source of evidence for medieval lifestyle. We looked at teeth wear patterns, dietary isotopic analysis, ancient starch granules trapped in dental calculus, and they provided an overview of foodstuffs which were being consumed and also gender differences in dietary habits. There's a study going on at the moment led by Shirley Curtis Summers looking at childhood dietary isotopes and understanding weaning strategies and periods of episodic childhood malnutrition. We also analysed the medieval burials for their likely place of origin. We focused on the children because we were hoping that they'd provide a local control of what people who were born and bred in Portmahomack looked like that we could compare the monastic population to, but they really surprised us because their rainfall and geology values matched the west coast. So in their short life, they'd been born in the west and they'd for whatever reason travelled to the east and died there. We don't know if this was a result of localised crop failures, unrecorded famines, or if they were part of the body of itinerant fisher folk that used to circulate around the Highlands, going from place to place. I think that generally the lesson to be learned is that the population is much more mobile than you would necessarily assume. So just a really whistle-top tour of our work at Elendonnan Castle, which we concluded last year. Elendonnan, you can see, is set in a really different terrain to Port Mahomet. It's at the confluence of three sea lochs, Loch Alsh, Loch Long and Loch Duick, so it's a really critical strategic place in the western seaways. Evidence for it existing from the 13th century emerges from the documentary record, but by 1580, when Timothy Pont does a survey, the medieval castle has been slighted and it only exists in folk memory, so it's quite a small period of time that the medieval castle exists. The field programme supported by the Contra Charitable Trust, who own and operate the site, began with field reconnaissance, topographic survey, building survey and geophysics, which allowed us to build on the work of Mykett and Roberts, mapping the medieval castle. And this established the probable circuit of defensive walls, and we were granted schedule monument consent to explore a really quite large area of the north outer ward. Work to date has identified the northwest tower, which you can see here was quite a substantial stone building. We've also identified two further interval towers, the west and north curtain wall, as well as several timber buildings inside the curtain walls. By contrast with Tarbert, people at Elendonnan were largely provisioned with foodstuffs. The normal farmyard animals are present, but they're supplemented by quite a wide range of hunted and caught wild food, which includes a heavy reliance on seafood. Crops such as oats and barley are indicated in the environmental samples. So it's another glimpse of the rural hinterland providing these foodstuffs for elite places. The material culture of the castle is very easily recognisable. This could have come from most sites in mainland Scotland and beyond. And there's quite a range of personal items which have been recovered, but the central artefact on this slide is the one that's most telling perhaps of how the elite were consuming medieval culture at quite a high level. It's made from a red deer antler, and it belongs with a pan-European corpus of highly decorative bone knife handles and these particular artefacts, which are hair parters, so they're accoutrements for dividing a woman's hair into sections so that elaborate hairstyles could be made. There are Parisian workshops producing similar artefacts in ivory at the time, and I don't think that the Parisian overtones would have been lost on the person who acquired this and used it in their lifetime. Later activity in the outer ward again shifts very fundamentally. It's heavily weighted towards craft working, and we've identified ironsmithing on an enormous scale there. We found in situ spreads of hammer scale, which we used to map the stance of the armoury and the potential location of the anvil. Again, there's a huge assemblage of very large smithing slags and a near complete rotary grindstone, which you can see here. It's about 60 centimetres in diameter. It's absolutely enormous, and again we think they're making large bladed weapons and sharpening them on the site, so it's a really interesting connection to the work at Port Mahomet. The ironworking phase is accompanied by contemporary non-ferrous metalworking, which takes the form of about 60 fragments of crucibles, which in their form and typology match the late Iron Age and early historic forms, which is quite surprising considering these come from in situ 15th century deposits. And lastly, we've identified evidence for boat building and repair on the island. We've got strips of unfinished roves, which you can see not yet cut off the strips here for making clench bolts for seacraft, and the other example is from Scandinavia. So I think I just need to draw this to a close by looking at the last site, Sinclair Gurnago Castle up in Sinclair Bay in Caithness. We were commissioned to work there between 2003 and 2011 as part of a process of rescue and consolidation and conservation on behalf of the Clan Sinclair Trust. The site emerges in the documentary record in the 15th century as the seat of the Earls of Caithness, and it's very much built as a cliff-top fortress. Fabric from the medieval period includes the building ranges of the inner and outer ward. but these are significantly altered in the Renaissance period, the addition of a very lordly palatial central tower house, and the gatehouse range is adapted into a very high status accommodation block. Really, the programme was undertaken to make the site less hazardous and to prevent further significant loss of fabric. And it required us to basically remove rubble deposits, so we weren't getting into archaeological deposits. You can see here a before photograph of the outer ward and a post-clearance photograph. So the medieval cost sort of rose up out of these collapsed rubble deposits. And it's really the site where, if you wanted to study the transition from medieval architecture into the early post-medieval period, that's so critical. And so with that, I'll pass the baton on to Martin, and that's the beginning of the early post-medieval period in our region. Thank you very much.